So our sermon title this morning is a question, and it's, what amazes God? You might not think that there's very little that would amaze God, and you're right, actually. There is very little that amazes God. But the one thing that it says that the scriptures tell us amazes God, actually, it tells us it amazes Jesus, but since Jesus is the second person of the Trinity incarnate, we can by extension say that it amazes God, and that is faith. Faith or trust in him and in his ability to do what he says he can do. Strong faith, the kind of faith that leads to an unflappable life. Now, this is not a term that's used all that often anymore, but it's something that has stuck with me as an image of someone that can withstand the storms of life, and it doesn't seem to knock them off course. They don't seem to overreact at times. They still react to what's going on, but they seem to take things as it comes and then kind of move on with life. It reminds me, actually, and one of the images that I love to use when I think about an unflappable life is the image of an improv actor. So someone that works in the improv industry, whether that be short or long-term improv, or some kind of improv theater, not necessarily improv comedy, although it works there too. I've taken a few courses or a few classes in improv, and it's not as easy as it looks. And to see some of these people on stage, like maybe from Whose Line Is It Anyway or other places, maybe you've been to an improv show, and you can see someone that really has the gift of just being able to take everything in. And they're so engaged with what's going on that a suggestion is made and they immediately say, yes, and this is what comes because of that, or this is how it happens. And as things change, you can see they just move and go with the flow, and they immediately react to what's going on. They're never thrown off base. They don't go off crazy because they're not expecting something to happen. And that's kind of the image that I have of someone with a strong faith, an unflappable life, a life in which they can engage fully in what's going on around them, but they can also move with what's happening, a life that is full of confidence and the ability to truly work to change the world. Now, I think many of us would love to have that kind of life, wouldn't you? I know for me, there's times in which I recognize after the fact, of course, that something that has just happened has caused me to become way more angry than it should have, or vice versa. There's something in my life that has kind of caused me to be really upset or really unsure of what's going on, caused me to question kind of everything that happens or that has been happening in my immediate circumstances. Many of us have commented on how unflappable the chief medical officers seem to be across Canada and really around the world. How confident and calm they seem to be as they're expressing the need for caution and for concern. And I can't imagine what's going on in the background, the different kinds of information that they're getting from different kinds of people, how some doctors are saying this is no big deal, other doctors are saying this is the worst thing in the world, how they're getting information and reports coming in from Spain and Italy that is really crazy, and from other places where maybe it doesn't seem to be as bad, and then they try to figure out how to manage, like in Alberta, how to manage massive outbreaks in Calgary and Edmonton, but then it doesn't really seem to be that bad in other kinds of places. And how do you maintain a full province and yet allow for some movement and different kinds of things and balance that with economic concerns? And I'm sure they're getting all kinds of things back from all kinds of people, just general people in the public, who are either attacking them or praising them. Man, but they seem so calm and so cool and so engaged in what they're doing. And I think most of us would love to have a life like that. A life that can respond to disaster or to goodness with either thankfulness or with a quiet confidence that God will see us through. Or we can have a crisis and not be overwhelmed by our circumstances. Now, one response that many people go towards is a an ancient philosophy called Stoicism. And you kind of see it in some Eastern religions and Eastern spirituality as well. This idea that the farther we disconnect ourselves from kind of what's actually happening in the world, if we can disconnect ourselves and provide some distance, then we can stay a little detracted from what's happening and not allow what's going on here to change what's going on in here. So it involves a bit of maybe disconnection. This might be kind of that old stiff upper lip of the British or the Dutch, where the emotions are just not shown and you don't let these things be shown. Life is just life. Life is what it is, and you just move on. Well, that's not quite what faith is, but that's kind of what that Stoic idea was, is that you can't step into the same river twice. Because as soon as you step in and step back out, the water flows, it moves some of the stones, things change. And to accept that, they say, is key. And to not be so worried about it is key. The problem with that is it actually detracts us or detaches us from life. Some of the people that I've known that are like that kind of have that outlook on life or live their life that way, seem to really be disconnected from what's actually going on. It seems as though they just go about their business, but they seem to be isolated from what's happening. And sometimes this can lead to places where massive injustice is just ignored because, well, that's just the way things are. And there's no point in getting upset about it because it's just meant to be that way. And that's just the way it is. And we have to stop being so angry about it and just let things go. But that's not what God calls us to. That's not the way I really want to live my life. And I don't think that's the way you want to live your life either. We want to be connected. We want to see and engage with the world. We want to feel the highs and the lows of what's happening in our experiences. But we want to do so also without becoming overwhelmed by them. And that's what a life of faith can really give us. Is there a way to remain fully engaged with the world and yet at the same time remain unflappable? Well, yeah, the Bible says, and it's called faith. Or maybe a better way to put it is trust. Trust in God. Now here's a bit of an aside, and I've wondered about this for a while, because for many of us, faith and trust seem to be two different kinds of things. If you say, well, I have faith in God, that gives one particular perspective, but if you say, well, I trust God, that seems to bring up different kinds of images. At least it does for me, and I wonder if it does for you too. And I wonder why that is, because originally in the Greek and in the Hebrew, faith and trust really mean the same things. And a life of faith is a life that is lived as if you trust God. Faith shows up in our lives by trust. Look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 11. So this is Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Faith, he says, is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So it's confidence that what we hope for will happen. Now, he's gone through a whole bunch in the front of this book to explain what it means to hope for and what we actually are hoping for because of what Jesus has done, hoping for a return of the one who now sits at the right hand of God who will make all things new, not necessarily hoping for some personal good thing to come in the future. It's not about God having a Ferrari and all you have to do is be confident and he'll get it for you so you can drive it. That's not what this is about. This is about confidence in the things that we hope for that Jesus and the Father have promised will come to pass. And assurance, this sense of peace that what we do not see is still there. This, says the writer, is what the ancients were commended for. Their trust in God and his promises allowed them to be confident and to be thankful. So confident when things go wrong, thankful when things went well, to stand up to injustice and wrong and even admit when they were wrong. This list, as you'll see in a little bit, is not full of people that were perfect. In fact, it's full of people that didn't fully trust God all of the time, and yet they did trust him enough to live their life in such a way that you could see God active in it. And their trust in God, or their faith in him, allowed them to be fully engaged in what God had called them to do, and the restoration that he had promised would come and is bringing here now. Look at verses 3 to 13. So by faith, he says, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So God made everything that we can see, he says. And we do that by faith, trusting that that is true. By faith, Abel brought to God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. It was his faith, his trust in God that was commendable, not a difference in the kind of sacrifices that he brought. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away, is a quote from the Old Testament. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Without faith, it's impossible to please God, because pleasing God involves having a relationship with him, being connected to him, and every relationship involves trust. Right? You can't have a relationship without trust. In fact, most, if not all, of the breakdowns in all of our relationships, I don't use universals very often, but I would say that this might be true anyway, that all of the breakdowns in all of our relationships are first and foremost a breakdown in trust. Trust. By faith, or by trusting God, Noah, when he was warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, by his trust in God, he condemned the world because he showed that they did not trust God, and became heir to the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and he went. Even though he did not know where he was going, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. He trusted God's promise when God came to him and made certain promises, and his children did the same, because he was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. He trusted that God would come true on his promise to build a nation and a kingdom out of him and his offspring. And because of that trust, he was able to leave his home in Babylon, to leave Haran, to go to a new place, to leave behind the riches that his family had, and to live as a nomad out in the wilderness with herds and flocks. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him who was faithful, who made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers in this world. See, it's not like they had it easy. The writer says these people, they received all of these promises from God, and then they didn't even really experience them in their lifetime, and yet they still trusted. And Abraham trusted for so long before Isaac showed up. And when Abraham died, the promised land that was promised to him was not his. The only land he owned was a tomb for his wife, Sarah. He was a foreigner in the land, and yet he trusted. And that trust led him to be engaged in what God was doing. It led him to help Lot and to rescue those kings. It led him to welcome God as he came to visit him. It helped him to wrestle with God about whether it was just to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, even though there was so much wickedness there. It led him to be engaged in the world and to participate in what was going on. Because ultimately he trusted that the one who made the promises was true and would do what was best. They trusted, and that led to incredible lives. Look at verse 15. If they had been thinking of the country they left, they would have had an opportunity to return. So if Abraham, after he had been called out of Haran and out of that area, if he had been thinking about that land and that thing that he had left behind, he could have just gone back. Plenty of opportunities. But he didn't. Because he trusted. Did he make mistakes along the way? Yes, absolutely. We see these all over in the story of Abraham. We see these all over in the stories of these other people as well. It's not that they don't make mistakes. It's that ultimately they lived their life from a place of trust. If they had been thinking of a country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one that we can't produce on earth ourselves. Therefore, the writer says, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. God is not ashamed because they trusted in him. Because they trusted his promises enough to live a life that was fully engaged with what he was doing in the world, he is not ashamed to be called their God. And that makes me wonder, because I've never really thought of that before. Actually, before I was really studying through this passage, I've never thought about the fact that maybe God is sometimes ashamed to be called our God. Maybe when we live a life claiming that he is our God, and yet not showing or exhibiting the kinds of trust or faith in him that actually leads to a life that is grounded, that is secure, that is engaged, that is loving, that is pushing back against injustice. Maybe when we live a life trying to secure our own future through our own endeavors by gathering as much power and influence as we can, or gathering as much money as we possibly can, or by trying to create a family and working hard to keep it together so that future could be guaranteed. Maybe when we do that and we try to work out our own salvation, in one way to put it, we try to guarantee our own good life, maybe God is ashamed to be called our God then. Makes sense though, doesn't it? Think about that. If I were still dating, I'm married, so it's a little different when you're married. Well, let's say if my wife claimed to love me, which she does, by the way, don't get this wrong, but if she claimed to love me and she claimed to believe and trust and have a good, close relationship with me, and yet didn't trust me, continued to check up on where I'd been, continued to do the things that I had, or follow through, maybe reading my text messages or going through my phone or whatever. Now, if you have reasons to do that, I'm not saying that they don't, but she doesn't have any reason to do so. But if that were the case, right? So there's no reason for her to go through my things because I'm not doing anything outside of our relationship. And if she claims to love me and to have a close relationship and yet is doing all of those things, well then, I don't know if ashamed is the right word, but kind of. I would be ashamed to have her say that we had a strong relationship, because it wouldn't be true to what is actually going on in our lives. And I think the same is true of God, right? Every relationship requires trust, and trust is built over time as people are faithful to their promises. Absolutely. And if we don't actually live like we trust God, then maybe he's ashamed when we claim to have a close relationship with him, claim to actually be in a relationship with him. Because he's not ashamed when this list of people live as if they trust him. And that's borne out in the way that they live. He's amazed at the life that comes through when we actually do show that we trust. I still remember some of the first times when, as a young couple, and we got married young, right? I was 18 when we got married, and I hadn't even known my wife for a year before we got married. And so it took a while for us to gather the kind of trust that we have now after we've been married for 21 years. And so those first few years were a little bit rocky. And I remember times, both for myself and for her, of choosing to trust the other person. Now that trust could have easily been broken, and there's too many times in our lives when that is happening and when relationships are broken because of a breakdown in trust. And I'm so sorry if that has happened to you. But if it doesn't get broken, if that trust continues to build, well, it leads to some incredible things. Leads to a life that even God is amazed of. That brings me back to what I said earlier in terms of, well, what amazes God? Well, it's a life of strong faith. And I get that amazement word from this story in Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7 starts off with the story of a faith of a Roman centurion. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum, which was kind of the place where he was living at the time. And there a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. So there is a Roman centurion, so a leader of a garrison of Romans, probably in Capernaum in order to guard that particular section of road, because that road marked a border between two of the Roman provinces. And across that border, there was a toll booth. That toll booth that Matthew or Levi sat at. The tax collector's booth was there. And so this centurion was probably there to guard that particular booth. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some of the elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. This man deserves, they said, to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So this guy apparently had built a synagogue there in the city for the Jewish people to have, maybe as a way to solidify his influence in that place, maybe as a way to kind of guarantee that they would be generous towards him. Maybe he did it good out of good faith, and he simply wanted to bless the people because he had been blessed. For whatever reason, the Jewish leaders said, look, he deserves this. So Jesus went with him. And he was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. He recognizes his place in this, right? It's not because he did something for the Jewish people that he deserves to get something from Jesus. He recognizes he doesn't deserve anything, and yet he still trusts that Jesus will do something. I don't deserve to have you come under my roof. That's why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word and my servant will be healed. I still trust. So even though I'm not worthy, I can't expect anything from you. I do trust because of what I've heard about you that you will do something. Say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. And that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does this. So this man understands what it means to have authority. He knows there's people above him that tell him what to do, and he better do it. And there's people that are below him that he tells them what to do, and they better do it, right? You go guard that tomb, and if something happens there, you will lose your life. You go take that prisoner to some particular place, and if something happens, you're probably going to lose your life along the way. You guard that toll booth, and then if any money goes missing, you'll forfeit your life because of it. So they do what they say because he is a man in authority, because of the place that he stands, and he recognizes that Jesus has authority. He sees in Jesus the same kind of power. Well, actually, not the same kind of power, because for him, it's just like I say, go this to people, and they go because, well, there's the threat of death on them. But he recognizes in Jesus authority over illness, over sickness, over all of the wrong that's going on in the world. He sees the authority of God himself present in Jesus. And he says, look, you don't need to come and do anything fancy. You can just say it and it will happen. And when Jesus heard this, so this is Luke chapter 7, verse 9. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. And the Greek word is thaumazo, which literally means to be amazed, to be shocked. This statement and this kind of confidence or trust in Jesus amazed him. And he turns around to the crowd following to them and he says, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. And then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. So what amazes God? A life of faith. And this is what a life of faith is. As we see this list of heroes, so-called heroes in Hebrews, and I'd encourage you to read through the rest of chapter 11. Pastor Dana next week will kind of wrap up that chapter and then give an application to our lives. But go through that chapter. See the people that are listed there. They're not wealthy or powerful. At least that's not why they are chosen or why they are listed there. They're not listed there because of some great achievements that they did on their own. They're there because they trusted God. And a life of faith is a life that recognizes, for us in the New Testament particularly, and this is what the writer to the Hebrews says, is a life that recognizes that Jesus is in control. It's a life that trusts that God wants what's best for us, that Jesus is the image of God, and we see exactly what God wants for us in him. It is a life that trusts God, and that he will bring about what's best for us. Maybe not in our time, but he will do it. It's a life that stands up to wrong and injustice and is fully engaged in the restoration that God has promised and is bringing right now here in this world and will bring again when he comes in the last days. Faith, says the writer in Hebrews 11, verse 1. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So how might you increase your faith or your trust in God? And how will that shape the way that you live? Being fully engaged in what is going on, working to make the world a better place, experiencing the highs and lows of life, being thankful when things go well and confident when things go poorly. Living a life that is unflappable, where you are not overwhelmed by what happens. What would it take for you to live a life like that?